Welcome to the fourth message of our series, Fight for Faith, a study in the life of David. Keep watching as we look at God's warning against our natural tendency to judge other people and ourselves by the shallow and external traits valued by the world, instead learning to focus on the traits that God values, the character of the heart. As I have children who then go through high school and they get involved in athletics. Tiffany was involved in cross country. Our oldest our oldest son is involved in hockey, and it makes me think back about my high school years. I was never a great athlete, but through middle school and high school, I did play soccer. And whereas I wasn't the best player on the team, I was good enough that if I worked hard, I was able to consistently start. In middle school and freshman, sophomore year I started on JV, and my junior year I started on varsity. And I remember looking forward to my senior year. I was really looking forward to this opportunity to say, okay, as a senior, I wanted to be able to come in and prepare hard and hoping that God would use my position and as a senior, as a starter, to be able to be a strong testimony, a positive testimony for Christ. We had a lot of players returning that year to what had been a pretty good team the year before, and we were looking forward to that, but we did have a new coach, and we were all a little nervous about what he would bring to the team. I remember as summer practice would start with 2 days in August, and we started meeting, and we saw right away that he was a different kind of guy. He had a very different strategy. He's extremely aggressive, and he always pushed the players further up the field. I was a defenseman or fullback, and even there he would push us further up the field to help a little more on offense. And I remember at the end of the summer practices, he called me into his office. He said he wanted to meet me after practice, and so I go into his office. And he told me that since he was playing such an aggressive style, it was very important that the players on his team were fast. And since he played the defense up, he said, especially now with defensemen, if you have somebody that starts a fast break, we need people that are fast enough to not get beat, to keep between the goal and the ball. And he said, unfortunately, the fact was I was not fast. In fact, I was the very opposite of fast. I was very slow. So I had always been the slowest guy on the team. I have very flat feet. Flat feet make you slow. I mean, if you ever look at my feet, you think of water skis, that's kind of what they look like. They're very long, they're very skinny, and they're very flat. And if you think about, okay, what's it like to run on water skis? Or better yet, if you've ever gone scuba diving, you have these fins that you put on Now try to imagine what it's like to run with those on. Okay, that's what it's like for me to try to run. And so I'm not very fast. And he said, that's something that in all the work that you do, I can tell that you worked on your game, you have all these different skills, but no matter how hard you work throughout the off or through the season, the fact is you're not going to improve your speed. You just don't have that. And he told me that as he looked at me, if I had anybody else, he said, if you were anybody else, I would cut you because you're not going to play at all, but because I know you're a senior and you started last year, I'm going to give you the choice. If you want to stay on the team, you can choose to stay on the team. But just realize that if you're on the team, that you're not going to play, and there's nothing that you can do that will cause me to play you. And I remember, just being devastated by that. Just feel like it's not fair. I've been playing, I've been working all summer. I was really looking forward to this. And it wasn't just a matter of even personal devastation. I was frustrated spiritually. I had thought, okay, God, you put me here, and I was really felt there's a sense that you wanted me to use this platform as a chance to be able to serve you. As a senior, to be able to use that opportunity of playing on the sports team, to use that as a platform, to be a leader, to use influence. And here it was, I'd done my part, I'd worked, but yet suddenly this seemed all taken away because of something that I couldn't change. I was slow. And I was frustrated, I was disappointed, I was confused. And here, what should I do? Do I stay on there? And even if I stay on there, what opportunity does someone who is at the back end of the bench, who isn't going to play at all, how can somebody like that have any positive influence? How could he have respect if he's not playing? Now, as I look at that, I realize that situation in some ways is very unique. It's a high school player and a team, and it is unique, but in another way, it is very normal. It's very common. It's something that is common to many of us. So I don't know if you've ever felt in a sense, it's not about soccer or a team, but have you ever felt that way that, you have a desire to be used of God? Maybe you have this specific area that, God, man, I'd love to do this. I'd love for you to use this. And you have this heart But the problem is that you feel like maybe God's calling you to something, but you feel like you don't have what it takes to make an impact. You don't have the ability. Or maybe you've tried and you failed and you kind of been put on the bench. Maybe you look at that and you say, God, I want to be used of you. I want to have a testimony at work, but I don't have a position of authority, and no one seems to respect me. And how can I have a voice if I don't have a position of authority? Or maybe you want to share your faith with friends and, but God, you made me soft-spoken. I just don't have the ability to go out and to initiate those discussions. That's not my personality. Or you want to share your faith with people that have questions, but you think, but God, I don't have the knowledge. What if they ask me a hard question and I don't have all the right answers? And, God, I just don't have what it takes. So I want to do what I feel like you're calling me and I want to do it, but I don't have the ability. Or we can look at it and we can say, even as a church, we believe that God wants to do some amazing things. We believe that God could come and that he can work in the life of our church to have an impact into the spirit of our community. And we pray that God would do some amazing things in our church. But you know what? Deep down, we think, well, God may do amazing things. He may do remarkable things, but to do remarkable things, he needs remarkable people. And I'm not one of them. And so we ask, God, can you really use someone like me, someone who doesn't have the ability, someone who's just an average person with no remarkable traits, or maybe I'm just too slow. I just don't have what it takes. Does he only use remarkable people for remarkable tasks? Now this morning we're going to see some of that played out in the passage we're looking at. We're looking at 1 Samuel 16. And as we've seen, up till now, we've been looking at the beginning of David's life, really, Saul leading up to it, because we're going to see that, that Saul impacts David. But here we're first introduced to David. And we're going to see see something of him. But again, to understand it, we have to start by going back and remembering who Saul was. And we need to see that in many ways, he was the people's choice. He was who the people wanted for king. And you see his failure. Now, as we pick up 1 Samuel 16, Israel is not without a king. They have a king. King Saul is still there. He's been a king for a number of years. And we're not sure how the people felt about their king, but we know how God felt. And we know that God was not pleased. Saul's rule had started out with great promise, but he was on a path now to failure. He had failed God numerous times. And he had all the physical traits, all the mental traits. He was the guy that you think should have been king. In fact, let me show you, if we go back to 1 Samuel 9, you see when we first met Saul, look at how the description is of him as king. And and this was speaking of Saul's dad, he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man amongst the people from Israel who was more handsome from him. And from his head upward, he was taller than any of the people. And so here you have this, what do they want? They wanted a king who would represent them well. Someone who would make them look good amongst the other nations. And here's this strong, handsome. And when it talks about handsome, it seems to refer not only to physical. This was an impressive guy. And they needed somebody that was going to be a military leader, someone who was going to go fight the battles for him. And we're told that he was a head taller. This guy was big. He was huge. He was the athlete. He was the big, strong warrior. And when you think about what they wanted in a king, you couldn't find a guy who had the character traits better than Saul. In fact, we see this in their response. Look now over to chapter 10, and we see the response that they had. Chapter 10, starting in 23, we're told, and when he stood amongst the people, he was a head taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. So that's basically, everyone else only came to his shoulders. And Samuel said to the people, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him amongst all the people." And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." This is what you wanted. You can't get anybody better. And they're like, "Yes." And they shout out, "This is who we wanted." But while he had all the physical traits to succeed, what we see then play out in the few chapters after is that he lacked the spiritual traits to succeed. We've seen in a previous study that now several times Saul has failed God in very specific ways. And each time the prophet Samuel comes and he confronts Saul about his failure. And in Saul, what he does is he rationalizes his sin, explains it away. He doesn't repent. He's not broken over it. He gives excuses. And ultimately, we see one of his greatest weaknesses is that he was more concerned about the people, about his position and what people thought of them, than he was about any sense of relationship with God. We saw this last week in chapter 15. Yeah, in chapter 15, he fails God, and after being confronted by Samuel and being told by Samuel, because you haven't responded, God is going to remove you from the throne. God has rejected you. Now look at Saul's response in verse 30. And then this is Saul. Saul said, I have sinned, and yet now honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me, that I may bow before the Lord your God. Now you notice what he's saying? His response is, okay, well, yes, I've sinned, but let's not worry about that too much. What I want to make sure you do is that you come back and you honor me before people, because what really matters isn't what God thinks of me, it's what the people think of me. And so I don't want anybody to think that God has really rejected me, so come and honor me so that I still look good. And I'll bow before the Lord, your God. It's not a God whom I have a relationship with. I'll bow before the Lord, your God, because it's all about performance. It's about the externals. And he was great in the externals. He looked good, but he lacked the inner character that ultimately would lead to success. Now here's where we now turn to chapter 16 and pick this up. And as we turn to 16, what we've got to realize is that you've got this guy in the story, Samuel. And think about it from Samuel's perspective. In the beginning, he had warned the people against choosing a king, and they persisted and said, no, we want this king. They persisted in calling for this. And finally, God said, okay, give them what they want. And so God chooses for them a king who's exactly whom they think that they want. But then Samuel sees the failure. And he knows that God has rejected Saul as the king. But only Saul and Samuel know that. That's not a discussion that was before everyone. Only they know that. Their conversation has been private. And from Samuel's perspective, there's a major crisis. There's an incredible crisis. The king has failed God. God has rejected them. And you think, what does that mean for Israel? What does the future hold for Israel? So that's the context that we pick up. If you have your Bibles, look at 1 Samuel, verse 1 of 16. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king amongst his sons. Now when we read that here, that he's grieving over Saul, I don't think that he's just grieving over the person. I think he's grieving over what it means for the country. No one else has realized it, but he knows that Israel is facing a crisis. God has rejected the reigning king. He's failed. He has removed his hand of blessing. And from Samuel's perspective, the prophet, he says, boy, the future is uncertain at best. And so he's grieving for the country. He's worried. He's concerned about it, and rightfully so. But again, look at God's perspective. Look again at what it says. He says, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Yes, that's true. But now look at what God says. Now fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king amongst his sons. Now here's the key that we've got to see. Is Samuel's all stressed out because he sees the crisis. All he knows is that things that he can see has fallen apart, and he has no idea how God's going to bring anything good out of this. He sees a disaster with no answers. And God, in the midst of that, speaks to him and says, Samuel, there is a disaster that you see, but I want you to realize that this isn't a surprise for me. I'm not stressed out. This is all part of my plan. I've already got the next king already picked out. He's not surprised by Saul's failure. God isn't destroyed by it. He's not all called off guard. In fact, what we're seeing is that God had chose Saul for a reason, to teach us and to teach Israel something. To actually accomplish something working towards his perfect plan. And now what we've got to realize is that there's a principle that's always true. See, it's not just teaching us about what happened then, it's teaching us something about God, something about his character, and about the way that he works in people's lives. The fact is that this isn't just about, the important people and the kings or the big national issues. The fact is, this is true for every one of us that have a relationship with God, that God is concerned about our lives. And you know what happens in life is that sometimes we go through things where we have reason to be distressed, where there is a crisis, where things have happened that we realize that we have no control. All we see is crisis with no answers. People have failed us. We get that call from the doctor that we've been dreading. We're told that our company is downsizing and we don't know what our future holds. Our loved one leaves or our loved one dies and we can't see a path forward in life. And what we need to realize is the fact of the matter is we live in a world where there's brokenness and people will disappoint us and things will happen and we will face crises at a human level that are way bigger than us, and there will be times that we have no idea what the future is. But what we also need to realize is that God always knows exactly what is going on and what he's going to do, that God's plan is never thwarted. God's never surprised. And whereas we see the crisis, what we've got to realize is that it's never a crisis for God. Nothing that anyone will do can stop his plan. The uniqueness about what we have here is that God gives a hint to Samuel, here's what I'm going to do. And the problem for us is that a lot of times, we sit there and God doesn't give us that vision. He doesn't tell us what's going to happen. All we see is the crisis. And the challenge is, can we believe God's character when he doesn't tell us, oh, here's the answer? Do we believe the promises? Look at what it says in Romans chapter 8. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that we might be the firstborn amongst many brothers. This is the promise. And that's true. It's always true. And again, what's rare in the story that we have here is that God gives a specific message to Samuel and says, oh, and here's what I'm going to do. I am going to do this next king, and you get to know who it is. And the fact of the matter is, while most of us don't see that, the fact is God always has a plan. That it is always there. It's something that we don't see. And the challenge is, can we believe God when we don't see it? Can we believe that God's character and what he does and his power and his sovereign control of what's happening at a national level, let alone at a personal level, is just as true today in our situation as it was back then in Samuel's situation in the life of Israel? He always has a plan. We never slip out of his mind. Our life is never out of his control. It's always something good that he's accomplishing, even if it's down paths that look like crisis and disaster to us. Remember the promise of what we have a couple verses later in Romans 8. What shall we say then to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And we might look at that and we might be overwhelmed because we have this that's coming against us and this problem, and we have all this opposition. But you know what? If God is for us, what can be against us? And not only that, but he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also now graciously give us all things? And sometimes we sit there, but do I know that he really plans to really take care of me? You know what? If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, this is how much God loved you. That while you were a sinner, he sent his son, Christ Jesus, to come and die on the cross. He gave the most expensive gift you could ever imagine to make you his child. And now that you're his child, do you think that he will also give you things that cost him nothing to take care of you? Do you understand that you are loved of God? Do you understand that God is in charge, that God is sovereign, that you could never be safer? And the challenge is when we face the crisis and we don't get that note from God saying, oh yeah, I've already picked, here's the answer. Can we believe God when we don't get that note from him? Can we trust his character, believing that he always is consistent with who he is and that he will always take care of us? Now let's go back to 1 Samuel 16. We see that Samuel's worried about the future, and God says, okay, but I have a plan. And he says, okay, look at what we read. And Samuel says, well, there's a problem. God says, here's a plan. Fill your horn with oil, I'll go, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite. I provided for myself a king amongst his sons. And Samuel has a very practical concern. He says, but wait a second, God, Saul's still king. And remember, he's not a guy that cares a whole lot about what you say. He's a guy that really is more concerned about keeping his image and keeping his position. And if I go and anoint somebody else king, he's going to hear about that and he's going to kill me. Look at verse 2. And Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears of it, he'll kill me too. So God tells him, take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord, and invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I've declared to you. So this is what Samuel does. So we read in verse 4 and 5. Samuel did what the Lord commanded, and he came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, "Did you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate for yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Now, in this, we're going to see something about what it means to have a true sense of worth and value. Samuel comes to this thing, and you see right away he's received that Samuel was highly thought of, and people right away, are you coming in peace? Are you coming to pronounce judgment or blessing? Because they know that this is a man who speaks from God. And he says, okay, no, I'm coming to do a blessing. I come in peace. And he says, what I want you to do is that I want you to have a special sacrifice. And all the elders gather. All the others, this is a huge thing. It's like, if the president comes to your city and comes and says, I want to meet you. That's a big thing. And that's kind of what's happening here. And so he says, okay, it's not only you, but I want to specifically invite this one guy and all his sons. And what they do, this is a huge event. And Jesse's got to look at that and say, man, there's something significant. You think about it, okay, if the prophet Samuel has come and he specifically asked for this family, right away, Jesse's got to be thinking, there's some blessing here that's for somebody in my family. We don't know what it is, but there's some blessing. Because he's the only one that had been invited specifically. Now, here they are. They all come here, and they're all in the room. Samuel walks in. And as soon as Samuel walks in, he's the only one that really knows the whole purpose of this event. And he knows that, that God is there to point out the next king. And he walks in, and there's all the elders, and there's Jesse and his family, and they're all lined up from oldest to youngest. And what we're told is, as soon as he walks in, Samuel looks at this group, and right away, he has a perception about that's who God's chosen. Look at verse 6. When he came in, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Now I read this and I always laugh because I think this is a line that singles relate to. I know singles, they walk into a room and they see a guy over there and they're like, this is God's anointed. Yeah, man, I see this is who God has called me to. This is the woman that God has called. That's kind of what happens. They walk in and it's like, man, this is it. And so as soon as he walks in, there's first sight, there's an immediate intuitive response. Now, why is that? I can joke about appearance, but you know why it is? Because he looked at it and he said, this is a guy that has all the things that you would expect to see in a king. This is the guy that's handsome, that has the appearance, that has the gravitas, that has the size, that has the strength. He's it. He's it. Now remember the last time they chose a king? And God said, okay, choose the guy that has all the stuff that you would think that the king should have. It was Saul. He was the guy that was like this. And he had everything that you would hope for, but yet he failed. And what you have here is Eliab, this man here, is he's basically Saul version 2. He's the guy that if you look at it and say, who's the next generation of a guy like King Saul who has all the things that you would look for, who had it, this is it. And in spite of everything that just happened with Saul, even the prophet Samuel now looks and says, well, if we're going to have a king, we've got to have the king that has these externals. Now look at what God tells him, verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. He says God doesn't look at the things that man sees. Man sees the outward appearance. Literally, he sees with the eyes. But God looks beyond that. God looks at the heart. And when you think about, remember the first guy that had everything that you want. The first guy that had everything that you thought a king needed, he failed miserably. But it's not about outward qualities. It's about something that's inward. Now, it doesn't mean that God, is against people that are good looking. We read in verse 12 that David is defined as, as good looking, but he wasn't big, he was strong, he was young, he wasn't who you would expect. But the issue is not that God rejects those who are good looking, or that is, that doesn't. The whole idea is that God, it's irrelevant. The issue isn't the outward. The issue is something deeper. It's something inward. Now, what you see here is that we're seeing something not through through God's eyes, but through man's eyes. And there's a positive and negative application of this. First, when you look at the positive, it's calling us to develop qualities in us that aren't the qualities that the world celebrates. Look at the people that our world says are celebrities. Look at who they say are heroes. The heroes that we have in our culture today are people that have done nothing heroic. I mean, we celebrate people, we have celebrities who are famous for nothing other than being famous. Because they're good looking, because they got on TV, because they said something funny, and then we can get so fixated on externals. And he says, no, that's our nature. That's not only our culture, that's human nature. And you have Samuel himself falls into it. And he said, no, don't do that. Recognize that it's not that the outward things have no value, they have some value, but they are secondary value. Look what Paul said about this in 1 Timothy. Well, for while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. Is there some value in physical training, of looking good, of taking care of our body, of developing these visual skills? Yes, there is. But the thing is that they have some value, but godliness is of eternal value. And we have to look at that. How much time do we focus on the outside? Even think about, we want to know convicting? Even think about Sunday morning. How much time did we spend getting ready physically and cleaning ourselves up so that we look good? And how much time did we prepare spiritually, praying or focusing on God so that our heart was ready to connect with God? And if for most of us, we look at that and we say, that answer we don't do well on for what we do on Sunday morning, the fact is that, boy, it's real easy to fall into the trap of focusing on the externals rather than the internal, the spiritual. Now that's the positive. The negative application is this, that he's warning us not to focus on the externals. We should focus on what we should develop in ourselves, but on the other hand, don't focus on ourselves or on others based on the external. We do that all the time. And, let me give you even an example. How do we choose? Think about how we choose even our national leaders, our presidents. Think about, we judge them in large part by experience. Let me give you the most recent presidents. Think about who they are, okay? Donald Trump, we have Barack Obama, we have George W. Bush, we have Bill Clinton, we have George Bush, Ronald Reagan. There's some things that they all have in common. One of them? They have a full head of hair. I don't like pointing that out, but it's true. The fact is that they say that, somebody that's bald, this shows you how shallow our culture is, but they have no chance to be president. So there goes my political career. The last guy that was bald that was elected president was Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s. And it's not only that, but they say that facial hair, makes you look a little less trustworthy. So studies have shown that. The last person to be elected with facial hair was William Taft, in 1909. And he was 330 pounds. Could you imagine somebody 330 pounds being elected today? No. Well, why? What happened? What happened is TV. And so we now have images. So we have to elect someone who looks the right way, who has a full head of hair, that has all the things. There are people that are great candidates, that have great ideas, but the fact of the matter is they don't have the right appearance, they don't have the right looks, they don't have the right charm. Where people really realized the power of this was way back in 1960, the first televised presidential debate between Nixon and Kennedy. And Nixon was really kind of the favored candidate. And they had this first debate, and what's interesting is that people that listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon won. But most people watched it on TV. And here's what happened is that Kennedy understood the power of an image. So he wore makeup and looked tanned and fresh. Kennedy was like, I'm not going to wear, or Nixon, I'm not going to wear makeup. That's a sissy thing. And he looked pallid. Not only that, but Kennedy understood this, and he made sure that they stood. And the whole time, Nixon was shifting back and forth because he was uncomfortable. Kennedy was standing. And Kennedy was trying to show him as being shifty. And they made him stand so that he was shifting. And not only that, but he wore a very light suit. Kennedy wore a heavy suit. And the whole time he was sweating and he was wiping himself, and it looked like he was nervous. And what's amazing is that the people that listened to the debate said that Nixon won. The people that watched it said that Kennedy won. And based on that debate, one of the closest elections in history, Kennedy was elected president because we choose on externals. Now, if we do that in elections of presidents, we do it in every area. In fact, let me just, three focuses of this application real quickly. Number one, how do we judge other people? We've got to recognize that, with people that, especially if you're single, dating, be careful who you're dating. Full head of hair isn't everything. I'll just give you that hint. It's just, business partners. How do you judge? who you do business with, even church leaders. You know, we can choose based on externals. It's not only how we judge others. What do we value in ourselves? What traits do we try to develop in ourselves? What do we think are most important? What do we give time to? Another application. What do we emphasize in our kids' lives? If you're a parent or a grandparent, what do we emphasize there? What do we teach them to value? And see, it's really easy to spend so much time about sports, and we're doing this, and we're running them around to all these different sports activities that we don't have time to bring them to church. And we give all this time to doing homework with them, but we never do devotions with them. And we've got to realize those things are important, but they're not of primary importance. What we need to realize is that in the midst of this, God is calling us to look at and see worth and value through his eyes, to realize what really matters, what's of greatest significance, and not lose sight of that. Now, when we look at back to chapter 13 and verses 8 through 10, Jesse had all 7 of his sons. He had 7 sons there, and all 7 of them passed one at a time, and God kept saying, no, I didn't choose him, didn't choose him, didn't choose him. Finally, after all 7 passed by, Samuel asked the question, is that it? And again, now look at verse 11. And Samuel said to Jesse, are these all your sons? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, well, go and send him, get him, for we will not sit down until he comes. And when he sent and brought him in, he was ruddy and beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. And you know what's interesting here is that you see something of the response. You know, sometimes we have people that we judge in the externals and they get snubbed. And you know what we see here was amazing? Is that Samuel had said, bring all your sons here. God has a blessing for one of your sons. And Jesse calls 7 and he leaves 1. That even his dad, Jesse, thought that David could never be the one that God would bless or use. Now you look at that and you say, many of us have been snubbed in many ways. Some of us have been snubbed even by our parents in that way. That he is seen as so unlikely that even his dad says, well, if God is going to do something special with one of my kids, it's going to be one of these 7, but why even bother bringing David? And so there's an incredible snub. You know what? And many of us have experienced that. We've been told, some by parents, by people around us, that we just don't have what it takes. We've been told by our culture, we don't have what it takes. God could never use us. But the incredible thing is that in the midst of this snub, we see even more so God's grace. Because God elevated the person that was snubbed, that failed, that had nothing in the world of the eyes. And so what you see here is that he finally calls him in, and God says, that's the one, go and anoint him. The one that even his father overlooked. The one that, that was overlooked by everyone. That's who God chose. The outer qualities were irrelevant because God looked at beyond the outer qualities and he saw something deep within. He saw a heart. He saw a character that his dad didn't even see. And he said, that's the one that I choose. Now, I want you to realize that in the midst of this, there's an incredible statement of encouragement that each of us need to see. We might look at this and say, well, I'm like David. I don't have his skills, and God couldn't use me. And no, what you miss is that everything that we're going to see about how God blessed David, it wasn't because of his skills. It wasn't because of his abilities. He was the guy that no one thought that God could use. And it wasn't because of that. God chose him because he had something internal. He let God work on his heart. He had a heart after God. See, and I know that there are many people here that, again, your family, people that love you, your culture, people have told you that you can't amount to much. And you know what? You believe that. And you're not the tallest or the smartest. You're not from the privileged background. Maybe you failed in the past and you feel that because of that failure, God could never use you. And you feel like if there was a call that came together and say, well, get everybody to come together because God's chosen somebody in this church to bless in a powerful way, you're going to be like, why even go? I know it's not me. And God couldn't use me in that way. And what's tragic is a lot of times when we say something like that, we say, well, I know God couldn't use me. We see that as a humble statement about ourselves. I know that I don't really have much, but I'm just a humble person. I don't really have what it takes. And my friends, what you've got to realize, that's not a humble statement about yourself. That's a low statement, a degrading statement about God. Because what it's saying is, my weaknesses are so great that God doesn't have the power to use me. That's what we're saying. See, you know what? Let's think about salvation. You know, we're saved by grace through faith, not by what we do. And many people, we understand that. And we understand there's great promise in Ephesians. For it is by grace you've been saved through faith. This is not of yourselves. It's nothing you bring. It's a gift of God, not by works so that no one can boast. And we understand that we're saved by what God does. All we do is we bring our need, we bring our emptiness, we bring our sin. God said, I agree with you, I'm a mess. I ask you to forgive me. I ask you to give me righteousness, give me grace that I don't have. We're saved by grace, not by works, not by anything we do. But you know what's amazing is that how many of us think, well, I'm saved by grace, but then once I'm saved by grace, if God used me, it's not going to be His grace, it's going to be my ability, my works, what I bring to the table. I didn't bring anything to the table to be saved, that's all that God did. But once I get saved, He kind of puts us on a flat table, and then it's all up to us. And what we need to realize is no. Right after, He says, you've been saved by faith, through grace, not of yourselves. It is a gift of God. No one can boast. Look at the very next verse. And we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God has prepared in advance for us to do. You are His workmanship. Literally, you are His masterpiece. You are God's design. He's proud of you. You're the masterpiece. Not because of what you bring to the table, not because of your abilities, but because of grace. And you are saved by grace, not based on anything you've done, but based on your awareness of your need and surrender to Him and ask Him to use you. And it's not only that you're saved by grace, now God will use you by grace. The incredible truth is this, that we've got to look at it and we've got to realize that God chooses to use people who are humbly dependent and willing. He doesn't use people who are able. He uses the least likely. He uses the people that are rejected by the culture and says, if you are humble, if you are dependent, if you are willing to bring your weakness, if you're willing to come and say, God, I agree with you, I can't do it, He will use you. Do you believe that? I remember one of the first times God taught me that was way back when I was in high school. When I was in high school and I wanted to be used of Him and I wanted to be a soccer player and I thought that He would do that and suddenly the coach comes to me and says, well, you don't have what it takes. You're too slow. There's, and you're like, man, God, but I want to be used of you. And I remember really praying, well, should I just drop off the team? And I thought, no, God, I think you want me to be here to be an influence. Okay, how do I be an influence if I'm a player at the end of the bench who never gets in, who's demoted and everybody knows that I've been demoted? But I felt like, God called me to be here, I'm going to do it. And so I said, okay, from the guy on the bench, I'm going to still try to be a positive influence. I want to encourage people. I can still be the hardest worker on the practice field. I can try to do all those things. And you would think that, nobody's going to listen to you if you're the bench player. But what's amazing is that I got out of the way and I said, God, I don't have what it takes, but I want you to use me. At the end of the year, they had the awards banquet, and the team voted on a couple awards. They had actually a new award that year, of Team Leadership Award. And at the awards banquet, the coach was announcing the different things, and he started to talk about, we have this new award, our team leader, the leader of the team. And he says, there's this guy that was, that I told at the beginning of the year that he wouldn't play at all. And he said, we put the vote to the team of who they were called to be a leader, and 19 out of 20 voted this guy, Rybka. And I didn't vote for myself. So that meant that everyone else, and I look at that and I said, I've got this trophy, and it's a trophy I'm proud of. You know why? Because it doesn't tell about my ability. It declares my inability. It declares that I'm too slow and I don't have what it takes to be a soccer player. But when I was willing to say, God, I agree what I don't have, but you put me here and help me just to be used of you in my weakness, God somehow used me in spite of who I was. And see, when we look at that, the closing challenge for all of us is simply this. The question isn't what you think of yourselves. It's really what you think of God. You might not have what it takes, so that doesn't matter. Because God's going to use you not because of what you are, who you are, your ability. He's going to use you because you're willing. And you might think very little of yourself, but if you think little of yourself but a lot of God, you're going to say, I have such a great God that He can use the slow, flat-footed person who can't run to still be an influence. He could use the least likely to be used of Him for His glory. If you think too little of Him, you're going to look at your limitations. If God couldn't use me. What are you willing to believe of God? The incredible thing is it's an incredible story, not only of what God did in the life of a young person that even his dad overlooked, but of what God continues to do in the least likely people even today. Are you willing to believe it and apply it to your own life?
Thanks for watching. If you have any questions about what we talked about, Jesus Christ or church, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook, Instagram, or by email. The links are in the description.